Welcome to an extra special bonus episode of Sistory History. Joining us to discuss his book, X Marks the Spot, An Adventurous History of Archaeology, is the historian, author and broadcaster, the most excellent Professor Michael Scott. Hello, it's lovely to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for the very generous and kind introduction.
You're more than welcome. We're recording this on the 6th of June 2024, the day your book is released in paperback. And as the listeners will find out very soon, it's an incredible read. But first, let's take a moment to recognise one of your achievements to date, in particular, International Lego Classicist of the Year 2022.
This is very cool. Did your figure come with accessories?
Well, yeah, so it was a two-step process. I was made a Lego classicist back in 2019. There's this sort of subsect thing of classicists around the world that get made up in little Lego figures. So I had my little Lego me sent through. And then when becoming International Lego Classicist of the Year, you get a little column podium to put your figure on and then a sort of gold, statue version of the figure as well. So there are umpteen fantastic Lego creations as a result of this. And my wider family, obviously decided to take the mick a little bit by buying my wife and I the Lego Colosseum to build, which is quite an undertaking at 5,500 pieces of Lego. So my wife and I sat there for quite some time building this piece. And I have to admit, it gets a tad samey because there's a lot of beige blocks of stone. But we now have a Lego Colosseum, which the Lego Classicist and International Lego Classicist figures fit happily within. And now we've just got to decide what to do with it permanently, because it's quite a big thing, the Colosseum. And our latest plan is we're going to establish it in the garden, fill it with some earth and grow some plants in it.
Oh, incredible. Now, many of our listeners, if not all, will know exactly who you are. But for those who don't, would you just mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do when you're not building or indeed being Lego?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a majority of my time. So I'm an academic and I'm a classicist by training. So that means I study the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and particularly their history and archaeology. But for me, starting out as an academic, when I was doing my PhD, I started doing quite a few talks with schools about the subjects that I was studying. And this, for me, was a really key part of what it was to be an academic. I didn't quite understand why you would want to do a job where you dedicate your life to studying a particular subject without wanting to tell as many people as possible who will listen to you about it and why you think it's cool and worthwhile. And so when I went into it post-PhD as a career, I was determined that I really wanted to both teach, obviously, within the university, research on the topic, but also engage as wide a world as possible about the topic. And I've done that ever since through writing books intended for kind of wide public audiences, lots of podcasts like this one, but also was lucky enough to write and present a whole batch of TV programs for BBC, ITV, National Geographic, SBS in Australia about different aspects of the ancient world. And of course, that was huge fun because you get out and about into the spaces and the places that the ancients occupied. My job at the university has continued all the way through that, and my latest role is actually morphing slightly away from the teaching within the university to work as the Pro-Vice Chancellor for International Affairs at the University of Warwick, which means I have responsibility for all the international facing aspects.
Very varied. Okay, to get things started, could you introduce the book for us? What's it about? What inspired you to write it?
Well, as an archaeologist, I can openly say that I was probably quite heavily inspired to get involved in this line of work because of Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones were the first movie, came out the year I was born, 1981, and he's been a staple, or the character's been a staple of me growing up. Now, obviously, the more you become an archaeologist, the more you realize that Indiana Jones is actually the worst possible kind of archaeologist, because he basically destroys every site he goes into. And he's only ever after one thing, the really nice, gold, expensive or mysterious thing, as opposed to actually trying to understand the site for all of its worth and for all of its different pieces of evidence that is available. But this book came about because I think in the public mindset, there's two images in your head when you talk about discoverers of the past. There's the Indiana Jones image, And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a very boring bunch of people digging in the dirt, kind of talking unintelligibly to themselves about, levels and stratigraphy and all of this. And there's not really much in between. And actually, archaeology as a discipline is relatively modern. It's only really over the last 200 years that it's really developed and been recognized as a discipline. In that time, you've had an incredible set of leaps forward in terms of how we approach archaeology of the past, where we do it, how we do it, the technology that's involved, the morals and ethics involved in archaeology as well. And so the book seeks to sort of tell that journey, really, of the development of archaeology of a discipline over the last 200 or so years through the stories of 8 incredible era-defining discoveries and their discoverers, and the wider geopolitics and other key impeti that really go into why that particular thing was found in that particular place at that particular time. And so what I want to give readers is not only a kind of recipe book, if you like, for what makes a really extraordinary discovery, but also open their eyes to some of the decisions and factors that affect what kinds of discoveries we make about the past when, and also to just fill in that spectrum a bit so that it's not just Indiana Jones on the one hand and people digging in a trench on the other.
As well as a couple of big hitters that many people will probably be familiar with, so the Rosetta Stone and Machu Picchu, there are also some lesser known discoveries that you cover. Some of them really quite astounding. Were they already in your head as a sort of short list or long list that you wanted to talk about and explore? Or was there something else at play that came into the decision making?
It was pretty hard to get it down to the 8 in the book. And, there's definitely a volume 2 of other discoveries that we could do. It was a bit of a mix of all those things, really. I mean, I think from the perspective of writing a book with a very much a public audience in mind, you need some recognizable names in there. If it was 8 completely obscure discoveries, people, I think, would think, kind of, is this for me? So on the one hand, it's really important, I think, to have some of those stories like the Rosetta Stone, the Terracotta Warriors in there, but hopefully bringing some fresh information to the table about even those discoveries that people thought they knew about. But then alongside that, I wanted very much to make sure that we were across that 200 years or so that we were talking about, the development of archaeology as a discipline, that we were moving globally around the world to different places. So I was keen to make sure that we were, zooming to some different countries and continents as part of that, and dropping in along that timeline as well, and also bringing to bear different kinds of archaeology. So one of my favorite chapters is the underwater archaeology chapter, where you go in search of the Uluburun Shipwreck, which was done in the 1970s, but to this day, it's still the deepest underwater excavation that's been carried out using traditional scuba equipment that's ever been attempted. And it was over 10,000 dives down to the bottom. And I know we'll come back to think about that one maybe a little bit later on. Then to have within that some of the ones that I didn't know about when starting writing this book. And actually, in that search for what are these moments in time and places around the world where great discoveries have been made, even as someone practicing in the field, coming across some of them and going, wow, this is actually absolutely incredible. But then I also thought it was really important to finish off with an excavation that does look a little bit like that one end of the spectrum that you might imagine archaeology to be, which is painfully slow, deliberate, careful work done by professional archaeologists over years and years and years and years and years, leading to eventually, crumbs of the picture coming together to create something at the end extraordinary. And we have to recognize that is absolutely part of the picture of archaeology as well. And how do you tell that story in an exciting and engaging way?
So the weather can also affect the excavation process, can't it?
Yeah, very much so. It's another of these factors as to why particular pasts are preserved for us in the first place, and what kinds of evidence survive as a result in particular parts of the world. So, one of the chapters we look at is Sir Mark Aurel Stein, who went off up from India into the Taklamakan Desert, which is, one of the harshest environments in the world to survive in. But being a very dry desert environment, what survives are manuscripts, parchments, actual paper with writing on that wouldn't have a hope of surviving over a long period of time in other parts, wetter parts of the world, like ours, kind of in the UK, for instance. So different parts of the world have different kinds of survival. But at the same time, there are then these unique, if you like, confluences of cultural practices and climate that allow pasts to survive to us. So in the Altai region between Russia, Mongolia, and China, there was a particular set of nomadic groups that moved through in the 4th century BCE, one of which laid this woman, the Princess of Altai, in a burial place. And their particular cultural tradition was to bury down into the ground and to build basically a house underground, fine, but then to build a set of what's called a kurgan, which is like a pyramid of stones over the top of that burial place. Now, in the wintertime in that part of the world, it gets absolutely freezing cold. And rainwater before the winter came seeps into the underground burial space and fills it up with water. That winter, with the freezing cold weather, that freezes as ice. Now, what would happen in the spring and summer is that that would all melt again. But because of the stone kurgan directly over the top of the burial place, the temperature exactly in that burial place never actually gets high enough again to unfreeze. And thus, this ice block, once created, is kept in perma-ice for us over thousands of years to now be able to investigate, and as a result, come across extraordinary things that have been preserved in the ice that would never have been preserved elsewise. So again, climate's coming to the aid, if you like, mixed with cultural practices. Now, with the climate changes the world is going through, obviously there's huge numbers of impacts that climate change will have. But one of them is on archaeology, because actually the warmer conditions in the Altai now mean that even that stone kurgan won't be able to protect those ice boxes going forward in the future. And so we will be losing, they will be melting, we will be losing these potential windows into the past before we've even had the chance to excavate and study them.
Now, Michael, in your book, you talk about what you describe as this itch or this magnetic pull that drives a lot of these discoveries and keeps people going back. But also, what came across very clearly is the harsh conditions that you mentioned earlier in some very physically demanding landscapes. I'm thinking sunburn in the desert, or literally falling off a cliff in Keros, or getting the bends in the underwater archaeology chapter. Can you talk to this point a little bit, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to, again, who are these discoverers who do this kind of stuff? Where are they on this spectrum? Indiana Jones versus the careful archaeologist that you wouldn't imagine as this risk taker going out there into harsh environment and surviving as a result. I mean, I think discoverers come out of this because they are a very particular kind of individual. Now, obviously, that changes through time because people aren't in the same way now striding out into literally the unknown. You know, when archaeology was first getting going as a discipline, and even through to the early part of the 20th century, these people were going out into areas of the world that weren't even on the map. I mean, literally blanks on the map, and having to find their way through the communities that they encountered and the environments they encountered, and doing it obviously without any of the technological support or clothing support or helicopter me out if things get too much support that we might now imagine today. So that element has receded of these people really going out into the unknown. But it is still very much the case. You know, when we look at the final example we look at in the book, which is that painfully slow, painstaking investigation on the island of Keros, you know, it doesn't sound too bad initially, does it? You're on an uninhabited Greek island in the Aegean, working through the summer months. Yeah, sounds lovely. But then you think, well, hang on a sec. So this is uninhabited. So what the team had to do every single morning, they were living on a different island. They had to get a boat over to this island where they were working with no shade in the beating heat of the Greek summer all day long on an island that has no facilities whatsoever, and doing it with high winds whipping up around them. And they're not jumping off into the ocean to have a swim every time they get overheated. This is, you know, hard, backbreaking work. So even to this day, I think discoverers are a particular kind of brand of individual who welcome that kind of challenge. And it is not something that is overcome or overcomes rather their desire and itch and drive to uncover the particular pasts that they are interested in.
There's a tenacity there, isn't there? A determination.
That's a rather nice determination. Those are all kind of nice adjectives to use, aren't they? You know, you could also use stubbornness. You could almost use single-mindedness. I don't think we should imagine all the time that discoverers were pleasant, necessarily easy people to get on with. You know, actually, some of them, as a result, led very solitary lives because of the way in which they were so single-minded.
There's definitely egos at play as well, aren't there?
As always, right?
Are there any other shared characteristics you could think of? I noticed that many of the expedition leaders were linguists. Do you think that's just a coincidence, or is there something in a linguist's brain that might predispose them to exploration or challenges that might come along with those?
I don't necessarily think it's something necessarily in the brain, but I think it is a result of the way in which archaeology developed actually as a discipline. Because way before archaeology existed as a discipline and people were going out interested to actually find the physical remnants of these cultures, a number of these cultures were known and studied through their languages and their literature, right? So we knew tons of Greek and Roman language and literature before people were really actually ever digging up Greek and Roman sites, let alone some of the other cultures around the world. So where did these original discoverers and archaeologists come from right at the beginning of the story? They came very much out of a language and literature background of studying these cultures and were the first wave, if you like, of pushing beyond that into wanting to then know more about the physical remnants of them. And then there are certain discoveries which obviously speak to linguistic issues. So the Rosetta Stone is a physical thing, but actually what it did was unlock languages. And so it required linguistic experts to be able to decipher it as a piece of culture. I mean, I think the other quality, though, that comes through, particularly now in modern day archaeology, is patience. Because these are not, no excavation should ever now be the Indiana Jones model where you zip in and within 2 minutes you found what you're looking for and then you're gone. It is a commitment to a place and to a site and to a particular piece of the past that requires patient, thoughtful work, often working now in large international groups of people, all who are bringing their specialist subsets of skills to the table to be able to make every single piece of evidence tell the maximum it can about the past.
Circling back to something you said earlier, Michael, as well as some unique geographical environments, your book also does highlight the political and cultural environments that are required at the time of discovery and how important they are. Just how close were we to never knowing about the terracotta warriors?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think this geopolitical question is one that's so often missing from the picture because we focus on the discovery and then we might focus on the discoverer, but actually, what are the factors of pushing them in particular directions at particular times? And the terracotta warrior example is fascinating for all sorts of reasons because the initial discovery was not made by professional archaeologists at all. It was a complete accident. A group of farmers were digging a well that they needed for that particular spring and summer in the fields that they worked. And they came across these individual pieces of terracotta. Now, they didn't know what to make of these. And then the story is complicated, but then there's a figure that comes along who does have some historical and archaeological knowledge, who realizes, oh, hang on a sec, this might be something, puts it together and creates the first terracotta warrior. Now, you would think they would have called every newspaper they could find and, told everyone in the world. And actually, their initial reaction, bizarrely enough, was not to tell anyone. Because at that particular time in China, in the early 1970s, they were just coming out of the period of the Cultural Revolution of 1966, in which Chairman Mao was pushing everyone to destroy the past, the olds, the four olds that were very much to be thrown out. And that included the physical destruction of large periods of China's imperial past. So this guy, he sat on it, don't want to tell anyone because he was worried, A, it might be destroyed, and he personally might be actually punished for bringing this past into creation. But what happened just in those few early years of the 1970s was an extraordinary political volte-face that happened at the very top of the Communist Party in China, which opened a window that had never been opened before in the thousands of years of Chinese history since the terracotta warriors were made, that made not only the Communist Party of the time be much more open to the idea of discovering and uncovering the past, but actually specifically of associating Chairman Mao with the particular emperor whose burial ground the terracotta warriors were part of. And that was a complete fluke that happened in the politics of the time, which meant that when that terracotta warrior was discovered by accident by those farmers, put together by this guy, when it was reported, not only was it not destroyed, but it was embraced with the full might and support of the Communist Party, who wanted to do everything in their power to bring this discovery to world attention. And within weeks, they had every archaeologist in the country basically excavating in this site. And as a result, we have the eighth wonder of the world with the terracotta warriors. But if it had happened a decade before, or indeed any time previously across even the thousands of years of Chinese history since the terracotta warriors had been made, it is likely and indeed possible that the terracotta warriors could have been left there, never further investigated, or indeed potentially actively destroyed.
It's quite incredible. If we stick with that geopolitical theme, in your chapter on the Rosetta Stone, you cover the tensions and the war and invasion actually that ultimately led to its discovery in Egypt. But British and French academics, if we come back to that collaboration, they ended up collaborating and shared ideas to decipher the language and the secrets of the stone. That is quite the switch around, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. It's actually a rather nice thing, though, isn't it,
It's
as
a
well?
nice
In that
ending, yeah.
it's not even a switch around, it's that the two things were happening simultaneously because the French invasion led by Napoleon of Egypt was very much a counter, if you like, to British involvement and development of influence in India. France wanted to have Egypt as their geopolitical linchpin for global control. Fine. But France also took with them a whole bunch of these historians, archaeologists, geographers to map Egypt because there was a fascination about Egypt at the time. And they uncovered the Rosetta Stone. But almost from the get-go, they are getting copies of the writing on the Rosetta Stone out to their global contacts and other academics who are not just British, but from a variety of different cultures. So you've got this war going on. And that gets more and more heated over the next couple of years, in which the Rosetta Stone itself becomes a kind of bargaining chip in the truce negotiations between the French and the British. And then the British take it as part of those negotiations and bring it to the British Museum. But that collaboration between all these different academics is happening at the same time. Now, it is a collaboration in that they're sharing the document and they're all working on it. It is also simultaneously a competition. They each want to be the person who cracks the code. And when we get through to the 1820s, and it really comes down to the wire between a French person who is credited with the breakthrough of the hieroglyphic code, Champollion, and another English scholar called Young, they have quite a fisticuffs with one another about who's really responsible for making that breakthrough. So it is both a competition between academics for the individual glory, the ego, but it is also a collaborative effort in that everyone is sharing the material as it's coming to the surface with one another, saying, look, does this help? Does this help? How can we approach this? But it is being done against the background of ongoing military competition and war between their respective countries.
If we stick with the Rosetta Stone, actually, what I really liked about that chapter was that when they were recording all of the finds in Egypt, the French troops, etc., they were running out of pencils and they kept having to make more pencils. You don't think about that kind of thing, do you, normally? How has the recording of archaeological objects and the sites even developed over the centuries?
The French group, they landed in Alexandria and they were sent marching to Cairo, and then no one had really gone further south than Cairo before. So this group were marching into, again, that sense of the unknown and coming across these extraordinary ruins that they were trying to capture. And at that stage, the only way to capture them was by drawing them. And they were lucky in some ways that the inventor of the graphite pencil was a Frenchman, and he was one of the team of specialists that had been sent along with them. But they were melting down bullets to make the graphite to make pencils, and that's a really lovely idea, isn't it? And those drawings are incredibly important memories for us now of what these places looked like at that period of time. Obviously, things have moved on in terms of how things are recorded since then. When Hiram Bingham III first visited Machu Picchu in 1911-12, he is open about the fact he wasn't the first person to discover the site. There have been lots of people who'd been there before and had actually scratched their names, into the stones of Machu Picchu with the date they visited. But he was the first. When he went back in 1912 with a proper expedition to clear Machu Picchu, he was sponsored by Kodak. And he took with him the best camera equipment that was available in 1912. And as a result, he was able to capture Machu Picchu, photograph it in a way that then, when in 1913 he released his National Geographic article about the discovery of Machu Picchu, the world could not only read about it, but see it. And that's what catapulted Machu Picchu to world acclaim and him to world acclaim as its discoverer, because he was its photographer in a sense. Now, you might imagine technology moves ever faster rates, as we're told. And obviously, when you're doing like an underwater excavation of Uluburun, you need a whole different set of tools to be able to do underwater archaeology, recovery, and notification of objects. But what I like is that sometimes actually the old stuff stays. So even in the 21st century, in the excavation of Keros that only really began fundamentally in 2006, they were still using pencils and paper. And the wind is so strong that they're having to use plentiful elastic bands to hold the paper down on their sheets. And the grit and the dirt and the sand was being whipped up by these winds so much that most of them wore kind of swimming goggles as a way of protecting their eyes. Now, by 2016, they all moved on to iPads. And now, GPS locators are able to map in 3 dimensions the location of any object that's found and immediately record it into a computer. So obviously now we're in a digital era where pencils and paper aren't necessarily the go-to, but they still work, kind of, which is nice.
And they still need the swimming goggles.
And they still need the swimming goggles. Yes, indeed.
Now, for all you ancient history fans out there, here is a quick word from our friends over at Ancient History Hound podcast.
Hello to Sistory History listeners. My name's Neil and I'm the host and creator of the Ancient History Hound podcast. As the title suggests, my podcast is all about ancient history. I cover an array of topics from the more well-known to the less well-known and across a number of cultures from antiquity. If you love listening about ancient history or are just new to it, then this could be the new podcast for you. But don't take my word for it. Go and find the Ancient History Hound podcast on whichever app you use and just have a scroll through. It will be great to have you join me.
Do head over and subscribe to this excellent show. And now, back to Professor Scott.
Okay, let's move on to considering some more of the sensory aspects of archaeology. We've touched on a few of them, but if we could develop some. In the book, you discuss not just the artifacts and the discoveries themselves, but the actual excavation process. And it's striking how much the senses can come into play on these expeditions. So if we can consider a few of these, for example, let's go with the Uluburun Shipwreck. What does being underwater do to the senses?
Oh, well, I learned to scuba dive in 2014 time, and I was imagining that I would find it a very claustrophobic experience. And actually, I was surprised that wasn't the case. Even though you're under feet and feet and feet of water, actually you feel an openness and a freedom in some ways. So I was thinking, this underwater archaeology sounds great fun. But they were doing it at 40 meters or so under the water. And when you go down that deep, lots of things start to change and the senses start to really be massively affected. So the first obvious thing is color perception changes because of the amount of light that actually gets down to that depth. Everything starts to be kind of blue or green and there's nothing else color-wise to see. But the other thing fundamentally is actually the oxygen you breathe through your scuba tank, or it's a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen, just like air is. But actually at that depth, nitrogen starts to have a narcotic effect on you. So the rule of the divers was that for every sort of 10 to 15 meters you go down, your brain is operating at the equivalent of having drunk a gin martini. And so effectively, you have to imagine that people working excavating in Uluburun Shipwreck were at the level where they downed 3.5 gin martinis and then were having to operate in an environment where all these colors had changed on them. But the other element of research that's been done now is that when you get down to that kind of depth and work over longer periods of time, and obviously you can't stay down for that long because of the amount of air that you've got, etc., and there has to be a certain period back at the surface. But when you're doing this day after day after day after day, like they were doing 10,000 dives across a 10-year period, the disorientation that you start to experience, the sense of the unfamiliar, and actually studies have now shown that your performance, not just because of the narcotic effect of the air you're breathing, but actually your performance affected by how unfamiliar, disorientating, and thus unwelcoming this environment is, your performance declines quite substantially, as it would do if you feel yourself in any kind of threatening environment. And that kind of fight and flight mechanism kicks in, which actually doesn't help you do the kind of careful, patient, detective work that you need to be doing for an archaeological investigation. So it is an incredibly difficult environment to actually perform in.
Yeah, I've dived to 40 meters a few times. I remember being really freaked out. Then there's so much to remember, isn't there, just for your own personal safety, let alone having to focus on searching for ancient artifacts that need careful preservation. It's incredible how much of a specialist skill that is.
Yeah, and really the people undertaking the Uluburun dives were the first generation of archaeologists, so people who had the archaeological skill and who had then learnt the skills to survive underwater, because prior to that it had been done by underwater experts who had no archaeological skills, so inevitably stuff had been lost. And before that it had been done by free divers. They were employed by early archaeological institutions to do the diving, to just go down there, grab stuff and bring it back up. So this was really the first moment where you had people actually qualified and capable in both archaeology and the underwater skills that they needed to be able to take it forward.
Another expedition you detail, which was quite frankly an assault on all the senses, is the excavation of the lady from her ice tomb in the Altai Desert. Can you tell us about this discovery and the process that they went through?
Well, this is the Princess of Altai that was frozen solid in a block of ice inside her tomb in the 4th century BCE. And then because of that extraordinary stone kurgan pyramid above her tomb, that tomb was kept frozen in ice until it was excavated. And of course, how do you excavate an ice cube? A big, big ice cube in the middle of a very inaccessible part of the world. You do not have your power lines and all sorts of things to be able to bring all modern technologies to it. So effectively, their technique was, you don't want to smash it kind of with a hammer or something, because you never know what you're going to break and what you're going to lose as a result. They heated water from a nearby lake over gas burners, and then with cups of warm water were slowly melting the ice layer by layer, inch by inch, to then uncover all of these objects. And of course, what blows my mind a little bit about it is that when the water rushed into the underground hut that was created, as things do in water, they float on the water, and as the water gets up to the top, everything kind of floats up to the top. And then they were all frozen in the ice, suspended in midair. So as they were melting, they were uncovering tables and bits of bowls and food, etc., that had once been on the floor of the tomb, but now were floating suspended up in the air as a result. And the ice had kept flesh in good condition. So as they melted away, slightly rotting, but still there, 2,000-year-old pieces of meat were coming into view. There was the remains of a special kind of yogurt drink that they used to drink that was still in the jar. And then when they got down to the coffin and opened the coffin, they found the female figure, the Princess of Altai, her clothes still intact, her flesh still on her bones, her tattoos on her skin still visible. So this is a visual assault on the senses, obviously, but we need to imagine the smells, for me, the absolute key thing here, that as you're melting a world that has been frozen for 2,000 years, and those objects are now once again warming up and engaging with the air around them, the smell of all of that is coming to the fore. And people talk about, who were there at the excavation, not just the smell, but the fact that all of this melted ice and liquid that is coming out of these objects sort of running around underneath their feet. And then, of course, you're excavating there day after day, deeper and deeper down inside a pit. You're not exactly, got the best washing facilities available to you. So this is accumulating day after day, week after week of excavation to be quite overwhelming, I think.
I don't think I'd enjoy that one, if I'm honest. Well, shall we stick with smells then for a little bit? Let's consider the Silk Roads chapter. And you mentioned these documents which were found in a rubbish heap in the desert. So this rubbish heap, it was still pungent after centuries. That's incredible, isn't it? I would have thought that those smells would have burned off in the desert. How common is it for smells to be preserved?
Well, I mean, we're going on the actual descriptions of the explorers at the time. So Sir Mark Royal-Stein and his team uncovering this desert refuse dump, and everything was chucked in it. And the thing is that while the dry sand preserves everything because it dries everything out, drying stuff out doesn't take away necessarily the smell that's associated with it. And it's all then being buried under tons and tons and tons of sand, so that when you do finally open up that rubbish dump, all of that smell, it's almost like a concentrated version of it, really, isn't it? It's the dried remains of everything that have then been kept in an enclosed space for quite some time. And yeah, it's still all there to appreciate centuries and millennia on. So again, not only are these discoverers going out to incredibly harsh environments they're having to survive in, but they're having to excavate in places and engage with pasts that aren't exactly, smelling of roses.
Yeah, nice way to summarize it. Moving on to taste, if we can. I love how often you include what food supplies were taken on these expeditions. Why did you want to include those details?
Oh, well, an army marches on its stomach, right? I mean, part of the problem with bringing archaeology to life is very much these characters of discoverers aren't talked about in terms of their real life needs. Yes, they seem like superheroes some of the time, going off into these mad, adventurous places and doing all of this stuff. But, they needed to sleep, they needed to eat. Often they had really quite personal tastes about the stuff that they wanted to take with them. And so, particularly in those early expeditions, when they really do have to take everything with them because they are going into a blank on the map and they have no idea what they're going to be able to come across. The lists are hugely revealing. Aurel Stein was an early convertee of Marmite just after it launched as a brand product. He's being like, right, if I'm going to take anything, I'm going to take Marmite and chocolate, basically, and coffee in plentiful supply with him. So I think it's absolutely essential to make these people human, because they were. But on the other hand, then there are people who have very particular ways of doing things. So the Professor Lord Colin Renfrew, who was responsible for the Keros excavation that kicked off formally in 2006. Now, he had been involved with Keros in one way or another since the very beginning of his career as a PhD student back in the 60s. By the time he came to it to do a formal excavation, he was, world-renowned expert, an absolutely incredible man. But he just had developed a style of doing excavations whereby he took sardines, tin sardines. That was the thing, right? And I was there in Athens when the team were prepping to go out to Keros and to begin this excavation. I was a PhD student at the time, and I saw these piles of tin sardines. And he was like, look, we're taking tin sardines, and then locally we'll get fresh tomatoes and bread. And then people will have fresh tomatoes, they'll have bread, and they'll have tin sardines, and they'll be fine. So an army marches on its sardines.
What would be your 3 top
Ooh,
comestibles?
definitely not sardines. No. No. I would be much more boring, I think. Cheese related would probably be there for me. Not chocolate in the Aegean, because it would just melt in your pocket within 5 minutes. Maybe a digestive biscuit, custard cream, or a jammy dodger. Maybe something like that.
Nice. Today, we have technology that allows us to share information instantly. In a pre-digital world, though, the letters and updates about these discoveries must have literally passed through people's hands, many, many hands, to get back to the newspapers, the wider world. Some of these letters must have been like gold dust, mustn't they?
Yeah, how does information get around in a world when you can't just send a text or send an email? And we've talked a little bit about Kodak, the development of photography being absolutely crucial to bringing Machu Picchu to world attention. But roughly similar time, in fact, to the discovery of Machu Picchu, you've got Mark Aurel Stein off in the Taklamakan desert in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And he's taking photographs. And interestingly, he's really interested not just in the archaeological finds, but he's also interested in the peoples and the local peoples and cultures that he meets and traditions he meets. So his books that he then went on to publish are full of photos, both actually of the finds and of the peoples that he met. But he is trying also to capitalize on a real interest and thirst for knowledge about what's happening by giving some kind of instant relay update. And the eventual output for this was the Times newspaper. They would have an update on what was happening, what's the latest from this archaeological expedition. And to get that information to them, he was writing a letter at the end of every day of archaeology. Every so often, he would send one of his trusted advisors with a bag of these letters back all the way round the southern part of the Taklamakan desert by camel, which would take a good amount of time anyway, to the main town, to Kashgar on the western side of the Taklamakan. Those letters would then be handed over to these groups called runners, effectively, people who specialized in going up into the mountains, the Palmian Mountains, the Taklamakan Mountains, and getting the letters over this natural barrier point, if you like, and into India, into northern India, which then they could be put into what was at the time then the British postal system and put on ships and then sailed to England and then delivered to the Royal Geographical Society, who would then distill them down into a particular note that could be passed to the Times to publish. And then that would happen in reverse. So the runners would pick up stuff from northern India, they come to northern India, take it back over the Tacloban and drop it back to the guy who was waiting in Kashgar, and he would then get back on his camel and go round and find R.L. Stein wherever he got to, around the Tacloban. So he would suddenly get 5 months of mail through all at once and be reading that and then turning it around and sending it back with the next lot. So in some ways extraordinarily slow, in some ways extraordinarily fast for the time. And as you say, the letters are as much a physical remnant and piece of evidence of the story of the discovery as the discoveries themselves are.
So many points at which something could have got dropped or lost, isn't there?
Yeah, you never know whether your letter made it or not.
On more than one occasion, you allude to how fleeting the archaeological process can be. So, for example, colours fading very, very quickly once they're exposed to sunlight, or even the shipwreck that had to be covered up again after each excavation season. How do archaeologists deal with this contradiction and heartbreaking emotion sometimes?
Yeah, it is again one of the really difficult and interesting bits of the job, and one I think in some ways that the moral and ethical discussions about archaeology have focused on quite rightly quite a lot. Should you uncover something at all if you know uncovering it is going to end up damaging it? Should you leave a past covered up, or at least until there is a technology available that allows you to preserve it? We see that with the terracotta warriors, right? When they were first uncovered, the paint and lacquer that had been put on them was still fresh, but actually immediate contact with the air, it shriveled within minutes. Just things literally disappearing within minutes in front of them. Now they have a technological process, which again is both high tech and low tech. So the low tech bit is cling film, and the high tech bit is it has a whole series of preservation materials they now use to maintain those colors so that they won't fade going forward. I'm not of the opinion that we shouldn't uncover, because otherwise we just won't ever improve and move forward, right, in terms of how we do stuff. But whether things then have to, once they've been investigated, be left in situ and covered up again to preserve them, rather than being completely removed and put into a museum, etc. That question is all about what's best for the object in terms of its long-term preservation. And sometimes the answer is to cover it up again. And sometimes the answer is to cover it up because actually you can't protect it from the still ongoing looting of archaeological artifacts that happens across the world, sadly, which we have to accept as a part that we're dealing with.
And to finish, I don't think we can let you go without asking which of the 8 discoveries you would have liked to have been present for.
Partly I would love to have been present for the Princess of Altai, for when they actually opened the coffin and found her, but perhaps not for the full period of time with the smells sort of, seeping into every element of your clothing. I would love to have been there underwater, the Uluburun Shipwreck stuff, but possibly not dive after dive after dive for that kind of relentlessness to kick in. And I think the oddity of the way of which Bingham first got to Machu Picchu, when he was sort of led there up a hill, tortuous, crossing a river up a hill, and bumped into just a local Quechua family that were living right by Machu Picchu. And his local guide said, "Oh, I'm going to sit here and have a break and have a cool down." But the kid will take you on, and Bingham's first visit to Machu Picchu, and we have photographs of this moment, is him being led around by a little 12-year-old boy called Pablito, who was using the ruins as his play area. So that would have been pretty cool to be there for as well.
And maybe then, which one would you have definitely not liked to be involved in?
Well, I don't fancy much being a soldier in the French army in Egypt, uncovering the Rosetta Stone, which was part and parcel of hard military work. The other thing, which the one example we haven't brought up, was talking about Mary Leakey, who was working in Africa in Tanzania in the Olduvai Gorge for years and years, when it was incredibly hard to access, and talking about things she had to survive through. They ran out of water, so they were having to drink water that had rhino pee in it that had been distilled down with a bit of lemon. They were having to survive attacks from lions, groups of lions who moved through. They had occasional rampages from other animals. They had a tame hippopotamus who kept knocking over the bathing tent when particularly female bathers apparently were having a bath. And that, I think, is an extraordinary survival story and tenacity story that I wouldn't have within me. I couldn't have done that.
No, it certainly puts my 9 to 5 to shame. Okay, then, and definitely finally, could you tell us what you're working on at the moment?
Oh, well, so today, 6th of June, as we're recording this, is paperback publication date of X Marks the Spot, which is great to see it going forward. But there is a new book which will come forward next year, which is with Yale University Press, and actually goes back to my roots of sort of working in the Greek world. And it's a biography of a particular Greek individual that I think needs to be re-examined. He gets a great reputation, but actually when you dig beneath the surface to the human, what's really going on beneath the surface? So that's a biography of a guy called Themistocles, who was named the most illustrious Greek of his time. But watch this space, question mark.
Excellent. We look forward to it. So all that remains for us to say is wholeheartedly thank you for your time today, Professor Scott. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you both.
Michael's book, X Marks the Spot, An Adventurous History of Archaeology, is out now in paperback, so do go and pick up a copy. It is a truly fascinating and at times jaw-dropping read.
Just the right size for a week's holiday, I'd say. If you liked what you heard today, then please do take the time to like, rate and subscribe wherever you download your podcasts. You can find us on social media, or why not drop us an email. And for more ancient history content, have a listen to our first 2 series.